The morning sun cast long shadows across what was left of the Fisher home. Detective Frank Navarro ducked under the yellow crime scene tape, his boots crunching on the debris-littered lawn. The blast had torn away the entire front wall of the suburban house, exposing the charred innards like a dollhouse broken open. Neighbors stood in clusters on their perfect lawns, whispering behind cupped hands. Frank had seen plenty of fire scenes in his 23 years on the force. This one felt different. Even from the driveway, he could sense it, the particular emptiness that followed violence, not accident. 3 victims, said the fire chief, falling into step beside him. Woman and 2 kids, moms in what was the master bedroom, kids in their rooms. Frank nodded, his face a practiced mask. His divorce papers had been finalized last month, and he still woke reaching for the empty side of the bed. Cases with kids always hit harder now. Family names Fisher, the chief continued. Daniel and Mary. Kids are Jacob, 12, and Emma, 9. Where's the father? Frank asked, already knowing the answer. That's the thing. No sign of him. Family SUV's missing too. As they approached the smoldering structure, an older woman with tightly permed hair broke away from the onlookers and rushed toward the tape. Detective, I live next door. You need to know. I heard them last night. The Fishers. They were fighting. Frank turned, notebook already in hand. Fighting how? Yelling, him mostly. Then silence. She lowered her voice. This wasn't no accident. The autopsy results confirmed what Frank had suspected. Mary Fisher hadn't died in the fire. A single bullet to the back of her head had killed her hours before the explosion. The children's deaths were even more brutal, throats slashed while they slept. The fire had been meant to hide the evidence, to turn bone and flesh and guilt to ash. The fire investigator pointed to the gas line in the basement. Someone tampered with this. See how it's been loosened? Then they lit a candle down here. The basement would have slowly filled with gas until it reached the flame. A timer, Frank muttered. He wanted a head start. Frank sat in his car outside Arizona Surgical Associates, where Daniel Fisher had worked as a surgical technician for 8 years. The building was squat and beige like everything else in Scottsdale. The interview with Fisher's supervisor had yielded the usual shocked disbelief, but one coworker had mentioned something that stuck with Frank. Daniel's been off lately, the young woman had said, her eyes darting nervously, like really quiet, more than usual. And he asked me the weirdest question last week, if I thought people could really disappear these days, just vanish completely. The next stop was Abundant Life Church, where the Fisher family had been active members. Pastor Wilson received Frank in a small office cluttered with books and family photos. I've been counseling them, the pastor said, hands clasped tightly on his desk. Marital issues. Mary suspected an affair, but Daniel denied it. He'd been pulling away from church activities, too. Did he ever exhibit violent tendencies? Pastor Wilson hesitated. Not violent, no, but controlling. Everything had to be his way, and lately, he'd become obsessed with the idea that Mary might leave him. Did he ever threaten her? Not explicitly, but once after a session, he said something troubling. He said, Pastor, I made a promise before God, till death do us part. Did Daniel ever talk about death? About harming himself or others? The pastor looked down at his hands. Once, after a particularly difficult session, he said something I should have reported. He said, if it falls apart, I won't live through it, and neither will they. I thought he was being dramatic. Later that afternoon, Frank interviewed Daniel's father, a gruff man with the same square jaw as his son's DMV photo. Daniel watched his mother and me tear each other apart in court, the old man said, staring out the window. Custody battles. Property fights. He was 16 when it finalized. Told me right then he'd never put kids through that. Said he'd rather die. Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Rather die? The old man's eyes met his. I don't think that's what he meant, detective. The interviews with neighbors painted a picture Frank had seen before. The perfect family that wasn't. The charming, respected man who was different behind closed doors. He'd make the boys swim laps until he cried, one neighbor confided. Once at a lake party, he just tossed little Jacob off the boat. Kid was terrified of water. Another mentioned the sterile quality of their home. Mary loved decorating, but Daniel wouldn't allow it. Everything had to be minimal, functional. By day 8, Frank had constructed a timeline. At 8:17 p.m. on the night of the murders, Daniel Fisher had withdrawn $280 from an ATM at a convenience store 5 miles from his home. The security footage showed a man with no signs of distress or hurry, just mechanical movements and a blank expression. Frank rewound and replayed the footage. It was the face of a man who had already made his decision. On the 10th day, a forest ranger called in the discovery of Mary Fisher's white SUV, abandoned at a trailhead in Tonto National Forest. Frank drove the winding roads into the wilderness, his mind racing. The vehicle sat empty except for the family dog, thin but alive, huddled beneath it. Found him under there, the ranger said. Loyal thing, wouldn't leave. Frank circled the vehicle. In the back seat, a raider's cap, Daniel's, according to his father. Near a cluster of bushes, Frank found evidence someone had camped, a disturbed area of soil, human waste. Any sightings? Frank asked. Lady and her husband hiked through here 3 days ago. Said they passed a lone male hiker who matched the description. Woman told her husband, that looks like him. They'd seen the news. Frank gazed out at the vast expanse of wilderness, miles of trails, dozens of caves. Daniel Fisher could be anywhere or nowhere. The thought settled in Frank's stomach like a stone. 2 weeks into the search, the trail went cold. Tips flooded in. Daniel Fisher spotted at a gas station in Flagstaff, boarding a bus to Mexico, working at a diner in Colorado. Each lead dissolved into nothing. At the station, Frank built his profile of Daniel Fisher on a corkboard. Surgical tech, churchgoer, controlling father, and now fugitive. The man who couldn't accept failure, who would rather eliminate his family than face divorce. A false ID almost panned out in British Columbia. A man with Daniel's build, working as a janitor at a rural hospital, even had a similar scar on his right hand. But the fingerprints didn't match. Frank began to dream of Daniel Fisher, imagining him melting into new identities, slipping through the cracks of society. In his darkest moments, Frank wondered if Daniel was watching them all, laughing at their failure. 3 years passed. The case grew cold, but Frank couldn't let it go. One evening, long after his shift had ended, he sat at his desk, reviewing the dusty file. In an envelope of photos, he found one he'd overlooked. Daniel at a church picnic, smiling with his arm around his children. He looked ordinary, happy. Frank pinned it to his corkboard and stepped back. If Daniel was still alive, he might have started over. New name, new job, maybe even a new family. The thought made Frank's blood run cold. He remembered Daniel's father recounting his son's words. I couldn't live without my family. It struck Frank then, Daniel hadn't meant he would die without them. He meant they couldn't live without him. In Daniel's mind, they were his possessions. And if he couldn't have them, no one could. On a clear evening in late spring, 5 years after the murders, Frank drove along the outskirts of Tonto National Forest. The Forest Service was conducting a prescribed burn, and wisps of smoke drifted across the road. He pulled over and rolled down his window, watching the distant flames lick at the underbrush. The controlled burn would prevent a larger wildfire later. Prevention through destruction. Frank understood the logic, even as it troubled him. Somewhere out there, in another state, another country, or perhaps even in these very woods, Daniel Fisher might be watching a sunset too, living under a new name, perhaps even loved by people who had no idea what he'd done. But Frank knew the truth about men like Daniel. The shame didn't burn away. It smoldered, waiting for a spark to reignite, like a candle in a gas-filled room. Sooner or later, it would explode again. Frank rolled up his window and put the car in drive. The case might be cold, but somewhere the timer was still ticking. The tip came anonymously, just a shaky voice on the line saying, there's a shelter north of Tonto, off a hunter's trail. Grave out back. Thought you should know. Frank Navarro wasn't sure why he listened. He'd chased shadows for 5 years, followed the ghost of Daniel Fisher down dead roads and over state lines, only to find dust and mistaken identity. But something in the caller's voice, a stillness, maybe, sounded like finality. He parked at the trailhead and hiked in alone. The trees closed in around him, the late spring heat dampening his shirt and turning every breath into something heavy. After an hour, he spotted it. A crude lean-to made of branches and scavenged tarps, huddled low in a gully. The place stank of rot and mold. Inside, the floor was dirt. A can of beans rusted beside a cracked lantern. Animal droppings and discarded cloth lay in the corners, but no one had lived here for a while. Behind the shelter, the ground rose into a knoll. At the base of a twisted pine, the earth looked wrong, sunken, recently disturbed. A wooden cross had been fashioned from two fence slats and tied with frayed rope. Frank called it in. 2 hours later, deputies exhumed the body. The remains were skeletal but intact, male, adult. No ID, but the dental work would match Daniel Fisher. A hole marked the forehead, clean, deliberate. But someone had carefully removed the bullet. Pinned to the remnants of a blood-stained flannel was a sheet of paper, folded and sealed with a strip of duct tape. Frank opened it with gloved hands. The handwriting was rough but legible. He came out of the trees, wild-eyed, shot first. We returned fire. He got what he deserved. Frank read the date aloud. May 22nd, 2 weeks after the fire. Beside the body, half buried in the soil, were 2 rifles and a pistol. The serials came back to Daniel Fisher. The pistol had been recently fired, 2 rounds missing from the magazine. Frank stood by the grave as the sun dipped below the ridge. The wind stirred pine needles across his boots. He thought about Mary Fisher's father, those quiet, steel-gray eyes. The men he'd seen in framed photos beside old hunting trophies on the wall. Friends, veterans, marksmen. Back at the station, Frank added the final photo to the corkboard, an image of the makeshift grave under that twisted pine. He stood there a long time, arms crossed, jaw clenched. No arrest, no confession. But something told him justice had happened anyway. He removed Daniel's DMV photo and placed it in a folder marked closed.